It's really great to be here. It's great to be hanging out with so many people who I admire from afar, whose work I've read. It's even more fun to be with all these people who I argue with on the internet. It's good to be meeting you in person. But honestly, thanks to Ion for having us. It's been incredible so far. And now that everyone's freshly optimistic after Joe's talk on optimism, right? Let's bring you back down to planet Earth here. So we have a great panel here. We're going to be talking about prospects for reform. I'm going to start off the conversation, and then I'll do a quick 10 minutes here. 5 minutes, I always hate it when I'm in a room with so much expertise and only a handful of people are talking, so we're going to hopefully get to the conversation really quickly here. How zoning broke the American city. Strap in, this is a 10-minute review of my book. You should still buy it. It's only $30. We know we're in a crisis on almost every margin in this country. Until about 2 years ago, I had to convince people in most of the country that housing affordability was even a problem. They were like, oh, that's a California problem, that's a New York problem. Nowadays, of course, some of the fastest home price appreciation is in places like Tennessee or Utah or Montana, places that don't have a history of talking about housing affordability, and they're looking for solutions. Luckily, I've got them. Quickly here, I'm going to talk about what zoning is. That's the most exciting part of the talk. If you have to go to the bathroom, you should do it during that time. What went wrong with zoning, and then where we go from here. So what is zoning, just very quickly? Zoning breaks down into two main components. You have the zoning ordinance, which defines the rules for every single district in a city. And then you have the zoning map, which assigns every single parcel in a city to a zoning district. What is zoning doing? Zoning is broadly regulating two major things. The permissible land uses on every single parcel in a city. Broadly speaking, that breaks out to residential, commercial, industrial. But of course, if you've ever cracked open a zoning code, you know there's hundreds of distinctions within that. You might have certain residential districts that only allow single-family homes, some that allow multifamily. Within commercial, it gets even crazier. These districts literally try to list out every conceivable business that you could ever open. And if you want to start a new type of business, God help you. And manufacturing. When we talk about use segregation in the popular parlance, people always assume, oh, that's what zoning is meant to do. It's meant to keep factories out of residential neighborhoods. On the contrary, it's doing so much more that doesn't really have a lot to do with traditional nuisances. Second big piece is regulating density. It's kind of a catch-all. Sometimes these are defined as massing rules. Sometimes these are defined in different ways. But broadly speaking, it's setting parameters on the amount of floor area that you can build on any given parcel. So the classic rule here is floor area ratio. I respect this audience too much to try to explain FAR. And so essentially what we do for every single lot, in addition to saying what you can and can't do on that lot in terms of use, we determine to what extent you can and can't do it. Great. Zoning, in the book, I'm careful to distinguish it from other forms of land use planning. So I don't really touch on historic preservation, subdivision regulation. I'm sure the folks involved in ION know those rules can have their own issues, but I'm really talking about zoning and the extent to which we need to fix it. So what went wrong with zoning? This beautiful Google Maps screen cap is of the Condo Canyon in Los Angeles. This is not normally what cities look like, to put it mildly. So I'm going to emphasize the affordability issue because, of course, that's what really moves us in the YIMBY movement. But broadly speaking, zoning impacts housing affordability in three ways. First is restricting supply. Second is mandating more expensive housing. And then the third is adding a slow and unpredictable entitlement process. Let's talk about that first bit, restricting supply. I was in a cab the other day from LAX, a particularly chatty cab driver. He asked what I did. I said I worked in housing policy. I immediately started getting oh, it's foreigners buying up the homes, it's investment companies, it's this, that, all the classic housing affordability conspiracy theories that people love to peddle. Normally I just go, oh yeah, that's nice, yeah. But my flight was delayed, so I was feeling ornery, and I was like, no, it's not that. It's because you can't build an apartment in something like 80% of Los Angeles. You can't build these traditional typologies like a duplex, things that you already find in pre-zoning or early zoning neighborhoods of Los Angeles. The only thing you can build in about 70 to 80% of Los Angeles is a detached single-family home, and because land prices are so high, that's going to be a mansion. I leave the design feelings about this particular mansion to you. Second big element here is making the housing that is built more expensive. So in suburbs, that might look like something like minimum lot sizes, which say, if you want to subdivide a property into many smaller lots, you have to do it on at least this much amount of land, regardless of what your intended customer would like. Maybe particularly in a high land cost context, many young families might actually like a small, affordable lot to be able to have their own detached single-family home, maybe on a lot that's 3,000 square feet in places where land prices are high. Zoning in many contexts second guesses that and says, well, if you can't afford a 10,000 square foot lot, you don't get to have a home. In urban contexts, these rules are a little bit different. In many cases, things like parking requirements do something similar, where they say, if the developer doesn't agree to provide 2 parking spaces for every apartment, we're not going to allow that apartment to get built, regardless of if the intended resident actually owns a car. This is a great graphic from my friends over at the Parking Reform Network. If you have a modest 2-bedroom, 675 square foot apartment, that might sound crazy to you, some folks from the Sun Belt, but for my fellow Manhattanites, this is looking nice. If you have an apartment that size and there's a 2-car parking requirement, that's double the amount of space that you have to consume. That can increase the cost of housing by $50,000 to $80,000 if you're going to have to do excavation and structure parking. If we're talking about a $300,000 condo, the type of starter home that we need, that could increase the cost of a new home by 1/6. And those are rules that make our cities worse. Third big bucket here is delaying the process. So, of course, part of what's gone wrong with zoning is because it's so strict, so many projects, such as this great neighborhood that we're in today, have to undertake discretionary review. Of course, this involves public hearings where strange people get to show up and yell at you. It involves environmental reviews for things like fourplexes. Because environmental review, we did this whole framework for nuclear plants and damming projects, and now it's applying to every little infill project. Of course, this adds delay, it adds entitlement risk. A lot of things don't get built. In the book, I'm going to breeze through this here. I talk about how zoning touches on a whole bunch of other things that, of course, everyone in this room cares deeply about. Restricting growth in some of our most productive regions, entrenching racial and economic class-based segregation. Here's a picture I took. I love this. This is on the right, it's from Austin, Texas. On the left is one of these all are welcome here signs. It's a nice sentiment. I don't have any problem with that. I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing to have in your yard. And then right next to it is a sign opposing an upzoning that would allow additional housing to be built. I guess the irony is lost on the homeowner here. But these rules fairly explicitly entrench segregation. They divide people based on how much wealth you have. And of course, in the US context, that has implications for race. It saps some of our most productive cities and regions. Here's this massing from Lamberto. I see him smiling over there. I love this, right? And of course, you got plenty of this stuff from Joe. But in broad brushstrokes here, historically Americans would move to productive, affluent regions and improve their quality of life for themselves and their children. They would move from places like where I'm from, Kentucky, to the industrial Midwest or to California and dramatically improve their quality of life, or they would move to a place like New York City or Philadelphia. Today, Americans do the opposite, and they don't do the opposite because there's better jobs in some of these less affluent states. They do the opposite because that's where the affordable housing is. I don't have any problem with states that are receiving people. I think Arizona and Utah and certainly South Carolina are extremely beautiful states, but if families are being forced to move simply to get access to affordable housing, that to me is a symptom of something deeply, deeply wrong. Third here, and of course this is not going to be news to any of the new urbanists in the room, zoning and sustainability and integrated walkable communities. Of course, zoning in many cases requires that we waste more land, that all new development be dependent on cars, these types of inherently walkable, sustainable communities the type of neighborhoods that would gradually emerge before zoning, of course, are illegal. On the right is a picture from DC. Anybody here lived or spent time in DC? You see these everywhere. They're former commercial storefronts that are in basically every pre-zoning residential neighborhood. These used to be groceries. These used to be doctor's offices. These used to be barber shops. Under current zoning, in many cases, they can't actually be used for commercial uses anymore. And then, of course, because we restrict housing, in many cases, housing will just outbid that space anyway. Okay, is everybody happy now? Great, everyone's excited. I think the good news is we're actually in a really awesome moment right now on all of these issues. Besides the fact that we could fill a room full of people to voluntarily think about zoning, there's a lot of reform energy in this space, and I want to talk a little bit about that very quickly. The first is, of course, local governments have it within their powers to reform or remove a lot of these regulatory barriers that don't reflect our current planning values. And that's happening all across the country. States also have an important role to play. In many cases, the local politics don't line up to where local governments can engage in reform, and states have an important role to play in this process. States delegate the power to engage in land use planning to local governments, and it's totally appropriate for them to have some oversight. And then, of course, the most provocative piece of the book, of course, some of you might have heard this already, I make the case for abolishing zoning and a wholesale rethink of the way we do land use planning. Of course, a lot of people in here are already working on elements of that project that I think are actually really valuable, and hopefully we can talk about that in the Q&A. I believe Emily addressed this, but local reform. Houston doesn't have zoning, but it has a lot of zoning-like rules. So here's minimum lot size reform in Houston. They dropped minimum lot sizes from 5,000 square feet to 1,400 square feet. Previously, they'd just been having developers come in and request variances every single time they did this. Rather than doing 1,000 variances a year, they said, let's just change the rules and allow for this type of townhouse, cottage court development. It's produced 25,000 new units within the I-610 loop in Houston, making Houston denser, more walkable, and more ready to transition to a transit-oriented city. Similar things are happening all over the country in places that you don't normally expect. You know, I gave a version of this talk to a slightly more conservative audience, so I tried to pick, you know, more red state or purple state examples, but this type of reform is happening everywhere. Same with the state level. So of course, here in California, the incredible YIMBY coalition that we have, putting up guardrails around local governments and saying, you know, you have to allow at least some types of development to keep the state affordable and equitable and sustainable. One of the most successful examples of this is accessory dwelling units. After 40 years, or excuse me, yeah, 30 and some change years of begging and pleading with local governments to adopt ADU ordinances, the state set up a framework in 2016. And what we've seen is an explosion. Something like 60,000 ADUs have been permitted. 1 in 3 homes permitted in Los Angeles last year was an ADU. That's partly a testament to how successful these reforms have been. It's partly a testament to how little housing LA builds. But I'm gonna emphasize the former for this purpose. We had a few exciting bills here that, of course, you know, our whole coalition worked on. SB 9, allowing duplexes and lot splits statewide. SB 10, exempting a lot of these missing middle upzonings from CEQA. And then, of course, this last year, our movement had one of our most successful years yet, passing AB 2011, which allows mixed income mid-rise and commercial zones, and then removing parking requirements near transit. So, like I say, you know, I think this is a pretty dire story in a lot of respects, but things are moving really quickly here, and it's really exciting. Other states are doing different types of things. You know, Utah, Arkansas. I highlight here Minnesota's actually 60-day shot clock program that actually Chuck Marone clued me into. A lot of exciting things are happening here to make it easier to build the type of housing that we know our cities need. And I also argue in the book we should look abroad. I highlight examples like Japan, where in Japan there's a national system. The process and both the substance is better. The substance, even the most restrictive zoning district, allows a mixture of housing typologies. It allows the type of corner commercial that allows people to live walkable, transit-oriented lives. But also the process is different. The national government defines the zoning districts and local governments get to map them. So you don't have every single local government completely writing their zoning code all over again, which I'm sure if you've ever tried to build in more than one jurisdiction, you know what a headache it can be to have to completely relearn the zoning code. I also talk a lot about in the book Houston. You know, I mean, Houston, of course, you know, if I was making the hard sell on a room full of new urbanists, I de-emphasize Houston. But, you know, I actually think we have a lot to learn from Houston quietly. Houston's, of course, the only major American city that didn't adopt zoning. It's not a perfect city. It made a lot of other planning mistakes. But to the extent that they don't have rules, you know, arbitrarily banning a strip mall from turning into a small apartment building or restricting a single-family home from turning into a fourplex, that's all helped to keep Houston one of the most affordable and diverse major cities in America. And I think there's important lessons to be learned there. Of course, you know, this book is not an argument against land use planning or some of the ideas that Hope will talk about today. It's not, I don't think any of us think that we shouldn't be engaged in land use planning or that there is an important role for planners and regulators. I'm a trained and licensed planner, worked as a planner. I know actually, to the extent that I'm critiquing zoning, I actually think it's something that's gone wrong with zoning is that it wastes this incredible civil service that we have of people who are passionate about the cities, who have an incredible amount of expertise, who are wasted counting up the number of parking spaces in strip malls or keeping fourplexes out of cul-de-sacs. If you talk to any planner under the age of 40, I guarantee you, they did not go into the profession to do that type of work. They went into the profession to build affordable, equitable, sustainable communities. So I talk a little bit about this in the book. I'm gonna leave you in suspense. I don't wanna give you the whole spiel here, partly because I'm running out of time, partly because I need you to buy the book. I'm still working off my advance, so anyway, thank you all, and I look forward to the conversation. Why don't we start with Sonia? Do you wanna?
Sure. How do you, I don't have slides, but I do have one map that I want to show people. Can I text a computer person? Sure. Also, my name is Matthew. Do you want to, here, text yourself this and while the map comes up, I'll introduce myself. All day today, you guys, none of the speakers, I think, hardly introduced themselves. Anyway, my name is Sonia Traus, and I'm the executive director at Yes in My Backyard. And our biggest project is called YIMBY Law. And although we have the same name, we are actually separate organizations, which is deeply confusing for the public. We're sorry. So YIMBY Law, we sue cities that are out of compliance with state housing law in California. And in California, we actually have a lot of great housing laws. You saw some of the more recent ones, but people have been passing laws at the state level in California for 40 years trying to fix our housing shortage, and, you know, kind of didn't go anywhere. A lot of those laws were designed thinking that developers would sue to enforce them, which is not a good mechanism because developers don't sue to enforce them. You know, we needed to start organizing housing consumers to have our own, you know, nonprofit enforcement mechanism before anything would work. We have a sister organization called YIMBY Action, and YIMBY Action has chapters all over the United States. We have 43 chapters in 16 states, including 3 in Florida and Abundant Housing Atlanta in Atlanta. So we have chapters in the South too, organizing regular people to say yes to housing in their own communities. You know, one of the questions in one of the panels yesterday is what is the right decision-making level? And if people are saying yes to housing, then the decision-making level doesn't actually matter. And so we are trying to organize people to say yes to housing where the decisions are being made currently, in addition to reforming the process. How are you coming with the? I got a website. Yeah, it's on a website. Yeah, if you could just put it up there. There's a map on there. Okay, so we're all like, here, zoning sucks. Okay, we've all decided this, right? California is about to embark on an experiment where we have a complete zoning holiday, maybe not complete, a zoning holiday in many, many cities all over California. And that's what this map is gonna show. There's gonna be a bunch of red dots on this map in places that currently have no zoning at all. And this is because we have a process that's like a good parent. The state says to cities in California every 8 years, you have to make a plan called a housing element that shows that you're able to accommodate a certain amount of growth. We have a state agency that hands out numbers. You know, Monte Sereno, we expect, you know, that you're gonna need another 400 units of housing in the next 8 years. That's a small place. San Francisco, we expect you're gonna need 82,000 units of new housing in the next 8 years. Show us you can accommodate it. Show us that you have changed your zoning, and you know, that you don't have any policies that are prohibiting housing. Show us. Now, in the past, this process has been a bit of a nonsense process where planners spend a lot of time and they write a plan, they submit it and they get a checkbox, and nothing happens. But Scott Wiener, a few years ago, passed 828, and now this process is much stricter. It's much harder to get your housing element passed, and at the same time, we've been organizing people, regular people. Everybody here presumably has an address, which means, or even if you don't actually, you have somewhere you regularly sleep, and so you have an elected official. And you need to be in touch with your elected official, telling your elected official that you support housing. Right, so we organize regular people, and so not only did we organize people to get in touch with their elected officials to support housing, but also the bureaucrats at HCD, at the Department of Housing and Community Development. You can lobby bureaucrats. Some of you are bureaucrats that experience lobbying. You know, you might not really realize it, or maybe you do, but every bureaucrat is a human being, and when they get an email that says, I hate what you did, or I love what you did, it affects them. So we've been lobbying the bureaucrats to be really strong and to follow these housing element laws, and it's been working. They have been putting cities out of compliance. And why that's important is that when a city is out of compliance, it doesn't have zoning. That's the deal. The state says, show me a real plan, a great plan. And they read these plans and we're like, this plan sucks, and the bureaucrat's like, yeah, this does suck. Okay, no, city, we don't accept your plan. And when they miss the deadline, they lose local control. They lose local zoning control. So in Southern California, people have started to take advantage of this. The deadline for Northern California is coming up. I wish you could see our beautiful map. Some places are real peaches, like Malibu, no zoning. South Pasadena, no zoning. I highly recommend you try it out. Go ahead. It's a great question. Great question. Okay, fairhousingelements.org. I know you guys all have phones. Oh, here we go. Great. Is it not loading? Oh, I'm so sorry. Maybe it's our fault. Make it load. This is Airtable. It's like a map we made out of Airtable. Great. So you can see also fairhousingelements.org/HE stands for housing elements. Oh, good. Yes. Dash compliance. So this is our page. You could also go to yimbylaw.org/buildersremedy, and there's a link to this there too. So yeah, if you want to, you can kind of get a sense if you scroll in at the bottom. But yeah, great cities. Yeah, South Pasadena, Malibu. In the Bay Area, like I said, the deadline hasn't passed yet, so you can see there's neither green nor red in the Bay Area, but it's coming up. I have 18 seconds left, and I've told you everything that I want you to know. It's going to be an exciting experiment, and what we predict is that it's going to be fine, right? We're going to have a lot of stuff applied for. Some of it's actually going to get permitted. People are going to have housing that they didn't expect in their neighborhoods, and hopefully it's going to be fine. And then nationally, we can all start to think about how much we actually need zoning. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm Salim Firth. I'm an economist at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. I was trained as a macroeconomist. Macroeconomics is actually really boring and barren, and I got to change myself into an urban economist. I'm having much more fun. So I get to come and speak to people like you and talk about real places and real things. So let me just do something really simple here, and there's a million things I could talk about, and I literally didn't decide what I should speak about until halfway through Nolan's slides when he covered this thing that I thought I was going to talk about, and I said, all right, let's talk about something different. And so I'll just talk about affordability. All right, so housing affordability is a super vague concept. Usually with other goods, when we say something's unaffordable, we mean someone doesn't buy it. In housing, when we say housing is unaffordable, we mean it impinges on their ability to buy other things. So that makes it a little bit of a squishy definition. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And there's a big debate within the pro-housing movement, and this has been going on for 50 years or more, about how to balance the need for new construction, which is typically relatively expensive because it's brand new and often nicer, with the needs of people whose incomes are low and can't afford that new construction. So I want to say that there's three sources of affordability, and just try to help give you like a mental framework. I really enjoyed Ian's framework for how to think about vehicle miles traveled. So here's just a similar framework, I don't have slides, to think about affordability. So there's a supply and demand effect, and once in a while you run into supply deniers who say that like, oh, if you build more housing, it just attracts rich people, and it's sort of like the spontaneous generation theory of reproduction, where if you like leave moldy rags around, then mice just get spawned. And that's not what happens. Doesn't happen with mice. It doesn't happen with rich people in condos. But it's also true that supply moves slowly, right? So as best we can tell, and this is going to differ by market, and markets also kind of blur into each other. So don't nail me to the cross if it's slightly different in Charleston. But generally, if you want to get a 2% decrease in rent on average, you need about a 3% increase in housing supply. So put that one in your back pocket. People are going to ask you, well, how much supply do we need? So it's 3 to 2. And some people say it's 1 to 1, which would be a little bit more optimistic, but let's take the more conservative guess. What that means is if you're a really unaffordable place, you say, oh, we really need to bring the rent down 40% here. Well, that means you need to increase your supply by 60%. That's a really, really large number of houses. And what that means is that, and that's not just like above what we have now, that's above like whatever your baseline projection, your like keep rent constant by matching population growth to housing growth, your baseline. So it's a lot of housing to make a real dent. And so that's kind of depressing, but there's two other ways to make housing affordable. So one is composition. If you build cheaper types of units, so that's the virtue of middle housing Karen talked about earlier, that if you're looking for diverse price points within an area that has the same amenities, well, they have to be different types of units. So that's fairly obvious. So we could tilt all of our new construction to lower price points. But even if you do that, you have to build a very, very large number of cheap units to really make a dent if you're not also increasing the total supply availability. And the third way is, and this is sort of the depressing one, is maybe just you get what you pay for. So let's go back to that duplex versus oneplex argument. So part of the reason that a duplex is cheaper is that you just get less housing, right? So it might be that I enjoy housing. I'm a sort of a linear consumer of square feet of indoor space. I'm a linear consumer of yard space, and I'll always just pay whatever the per square foot cost is happily and say like I'm indifferent to buying more house space. In that case, all of the affordability gains of me moving from a single family to a duplex where I'm having half of all those things, all of that is just you get what you pay for, right? A 1 pound bag of rice costs half of what a 2 pound bag of rice costs. That's more affordable, but it doesn't really help you that much. And I do feel like advocates sometimes fall into this trap of advocating for worse housing because they're just like, okay, well, we'll just have people consume less. The real gains come if people don't want all that extra space. And that's where we're really sort of hoping that we can make a difference. There's lots of people, right? So when we went to Earl's Court today, these somewhat smaller units were primarily purchased by single women, right? Those are people who, because of their household size, they don't want a big suburban yard and 4 bedrooms. So my time's up. So many things I'd love to talk about. I really want to hear what your reactions are to this panel and look forward to the Q&A.
Hello, I'm Michelle, and I'm a 53-year-old first-year lawyer. And I'm going to spend a little time telling you why I went to law school. So Dr. King has a quote, and he says, "The law cannot make a man love me, but it can prevent him from lynching me." And I think that's a pretty important thing. And so for me, I was not born in Charleston, but both of my parents were born and raised in Charleston. So for those who went on the tour today, my paternal grandparents grew up on Bogart Street. Their home was on Bogart Street, and my maternal grandparents lived on Poinsett Street across from the old city bus garage. My father is one of 12, my mother is one of 10. No one in my family lives within the city of Charleston. No one. So when I moved back to Charleston 21 years ago, I had been an industrial engineer and decided I wanted to be a high school math teacher. And very quickly realized that many of the challenges in the Title I high school in which I taught had nothing to do with the school day and had everything to do with the community that surrounded the school. So there was no grocery store in that community. If a student needed to buy pencil or paper after school, there was no place they could do it. And most of the housing was substandard. That led me to want to study and learn more about housing and community development. So I got a master's in public administration at the College of Charleston, and as part of that program, you have to do an internship. And at the time, the city of Charleston had what was called the Mayor's Council on Housing, or Mayor's Council on Homelessness and Affordable Housing. And the mayor had tasked a group of individuals, community members who cared about the issue, with finding creative ways of financing affordable housing on the peninsula of Charleston. And I was fortunate enough to be the second employee, the intern, and our board chair was Vince Graham. And so for the next 13 years, I worked at what was then called Charleston Housing Trust, then it became Low Country Housing Trust, and today it's known as the South Carolina Community Loan Fund. It is a $50 million community development financial institution that finances affordable housing, healthy food retail, community facilities, and small-based businesses all across South Carolina. But what we quickly realized is that capital wasn't the problem. It was our regulatory environment. And so from the very beginning, we have tried to advocate for zoning changes and lot size changes and, all the regulatory barriers that prevent the development of housing, because we realized we could have all the money in the world, but if we didn't have permission to be able to create the housing that we needed, that it was always going to be an uphill battle. So I went from intern to CEO in 13 years. But I realized that we weren't making the difference that needed to be made. And so I started asking questions. Well, why can't we do this? And why can't we do that? And I kept being told, well, South Carolina law prevents us from doing this, or we can't do that because of home rule, or we can't do that. And then I would say, well, why isn't anyone challenging these things? And no one could tell me why. And so I kept asking, and so finally our attorney, George Morrison, said, Michelle, I think you should go to law school, and you should challenge those things. And so I did. And so I'm here simply to listen and learn, and to think about ways in which we can challenge the system through the courts. And I know it's an uphill battle. I know that it's going to be difficult, but I know that we got to where we are now because there were families who cared about educating their children who challenged the system. There were families who said, I want to be able to live wherever I can afford, and they were willing to step forward and challenge the system. So throughout the history of our country, we've baked segregation into the system, and we're still feeling the repercussions of segregation by design, but there's always, 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 always been folks like the folks in this room who are willing to join together with people who did not look like them, who were not from the same place as them, and to challenge that system. And so that's why I get up every day. I'm in the middle of a 2-year fellowship with the ACLU of South Carolina, learning all that I can so that we can challenge the system here in South Carolina.
I gotta follow that, huh? Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ari Bargill. I'm an attorney with an organization called the Institute for Justice. IJ is a national nonprofit public interest law firm. We bring constitutional challenges against state and local government and the federal government in state and federal court nationwide. We've been doing it for about 30 years. We consider ourselves the preeminent defender of civil liberties in this country, along with great organizations like the ACLU. We do a little bit different things, but very much put together with the intention of preserving and protecting human freedom and individual liberty, and crafting a rule of law under which all people can live as free and responsible members of society without the arbitrary interference of the government. We litigate cases in a number of areas, including property rights, which is obviously why I've been summoned here today. To borrow a phrase from the civil rights movement, I suspect that there are those in this room who want to make some good trouble, and that is what I'm all about. So to get into kind of the discussion of what IJ does and what I do in this area, I thought I might provide a little bit of a historical background on some of the more preeminent zoning cases that have been decided by the US Supreme Court, give a quick backdrop of how we got to where we are, and then maybe offer a few thoughts before we get into Q&A about how some of those things can change. We've all heard about Euclid v. Ambler Realty. It's a 1926 decision from the United States Supreme Court where the court upheld for the first time the constitutional legitimacy of a zoning ordinance. It was not the first zoning ordinance to have been passed in this country, not by a long shot, but it was the first time where the US Supreme Court addressed the constitutionality of it. And the court at that time basically said, yes, it's fine for a local government to, pursuant to its police power, segregate different uses to different parts of a given municipal grid. And then the court didn't say too much about zoning for a really long time, at least not that's relevant to this conversation. But that was an idea that I think to those at the time wasn't super controversial. You know, the plaintiff in Euclid, after all, was an industrial user and didn't want to be told that he couldn't have his heavy industrial use located in a certain part of town. And so the assumption had long been, and we've talked about how this isn't really true, but the assumption had long been that zoning would be a mechanism for segregating noxious and hazardous uses away from residences, parks, public spaces, and civic gathering points. And that understanding persisted for quite a while. And I'm going to bring us to 1974, where the US Supreme Court decides another case called Village of Belterre v. Boris. And this comes out of a Long Island ordinance, basically that established single-family zoning and restricted the number of people who could live in a single-family zoned community to no more than two unrelated people living together. So this is essentially the government defining what it means to be a family for purposes of living in a single-family zoned area. And one other thing that I would add to that is that this didn't just set the stage or affirm for the first time single-family zoning as constitutionally legitimate under federal law. It also opened the door for a lot of the more pernicious things that we see today, where everything from the color of the paint that you want to apply to your building to the height of your grass, how close your buildings can be to the street, all of these things to the nth degree are regulated via zoning codes. And part of the reason why that's possible is because of a sentence that I'm going to read to you now, where the court opened the door not just to single-family zoning, but single-family living and a certain idyllic design for how people ought to get by in America. The court said, "A quiet place where yards are wide, people few, and motor vehicles restricted are legitimate guidelines in a land use project addressed to family needs. The police power is not confined to elimination of filth, stench, and unhealthy places. It is ample to lay out zones where family values, youth values, and the blessings of quiet seclusion and clean air make the area a sanctuary for people." I don't know what that means, and you don't either. But what it effectively said is, local government, you have the authority to basically do whatever you want, so long as that's consistent with whatever idyllic vision you've developed for the people in your community. And it also means that what it does is it opens the door for exclusionary policies, like the ones that we're contending with today. So as we talk about these cases and what the reforms need to be and what we need to be tackling and going after and what needs to have a bullseye on it, Euclid v. Ambler Realty is the thing that opened the door. But it opened the door a crack. The thing that blew it wide open and off its hinges, in my view, is Belterre. And that, I think, is what we should be focusing on for purposes of the discussion of what we can reform and how, and whether there's a pathway for us to do this constitutionally. Because the biggest problem I see when we go into courts is that zoning largely, and some of the things that we've talked about here that are outgrowths of zoning, are policy failures. And judges don't like dealing with policy failures. They think those are things that deserve to be litigated at the ballot box and not in courtrooms. And I'm here to tell you that there are instances where you can mount constitutional challenges to some of the more extreme and bad examples of zoning run amok. And let's talk about those, and call me so I can help you challenge them.
Great. Well, thanks to all of our panelists here. I'm going to use moderator's privilege here to ask a first round of questions here. I'll start with Sonia. Sonia, for those of you who don't know, she's kind of a celebrity among the YIMBYs. She's what I think of as the crazy YIMBY generation, where they were just showing up at meetings and like setting the precedent for what would become this huge movement. But you've been around in the space a while. I'm curious to hear if you have any thoughts on YIMBY pushes at reform that tried and failed. So I think we have a lot of successes under our victories, under our belt, but I'm curious if you have cases where maybe an avenue of reform that didn't really pan out.
Well, SB 50. But weirdly, so the reason this is a hard question is that we keep having situations where even when we fail, we win. So, so SB 50 was a state level zoning. You know, the idea that in California, the state would say within a certain, you know, area, like, a radius of certain kinds of transit, cities have to allow multifamily housing. And it failed. And its predecessor is something called SB 827, which also failed. You know, they tried 2 years in a row. But while everybody was freaking out about SB 827, SB 828 passed, and that was the reform to the housing elements process that I talked about earlier. And that reform to the housing elements process, you know, got us to where we are today, where we're gonna have, like, we have all these zoning free zones in these attractive areas. So, you know, it was a failure, but like, it really worked out. And, you know, for advocates here, some advice is, if you wanna do something, you might wanna have a distractor project going on. The other reason that 828 succeeded was that it was amendments to a very complicated process. It was very boring. There's a saying in politics that if you're explaining, you're losing. And so our opponents, even when they understood what we were trying to do with 828, they had to spend so much time explaining. You know, they couldn't rile people up. It wasn't like SB 50, where they were like, the state is gonna usurp your local land use powers, local control now, local control forever, and people were like, yeah. This was a local control process that we were just amending. And then there's other things, like at the North Berkeley BART, right? Like, they are trying to get like 16-story apartment towers, and they failed and got 7. But this was something that no one was thinking about a couple years ago at all. Right now, it's just parking lots. So.
Even when she loses, she wins. Sonia Strauss, ladies and gentlemen. Excellent interviewer. No, that's all great, thank you. Salim quietly spends a lot of time talking to folks in a lot of places all across the country. We did a little bit of this work when we were at Mercatus. I'm kind of curious, Salim, what do you think are some of the more underrated zoning or land use reforms that, you know, we talk a lot about maybe parking requirements, we talk a lot about single family zoning, but it seems to me that you've actually encountered a lot of reforms that don't really get a lot of attention. I'm wondering if you have one or two that you really want to talk about.
So I've certainly encountered a lot of low-profile reforms, and I think a lot of them are low profile because they deserve to be. But I think the biggest reforms that you can make that remain low profile but have a big impact are on process, right? So the reason that California's like zoning holiday is working, and Massachusetts has had something that sounds very similar on the books for 40 years, and it's not transformative, is that in Massachusetts, the process involves saying to a community, you're out of compliance, here's a proposal, and the town says, we don't like that proposal, and they send it back to you, and you go back and forth for several years, and eventually you get to build your project. That is not transformative. And so finding these process tweaks, a number of states, Florida, Texas, I think Utah have followed Minnesota with the shot clock approach, where you have to approve certain types of plans or permit requests within, it's usually like 30 business days, or else it's deemed approved. Local governments that don't want to do this have found ways to wiggle around it, but I think eventually you can get a culture shift where the culture within the local government just becomes, okay, we have to turn things around fast, and we hire enough staff, and we are unpicky enough that we just give the approvals that we are legally required to give, or reject, in the cases where there's good grounds for rejection. So I think that's the area where you can kind of get the biggest bang for your buck, but you have to really understand process.
Add something that I just realized today is actually very revolutionary. I was listening to Ari. Something that we passed a couple years ago is a requirement that cities, the rule is cities can only enforce objective standards in their zoning code. So technically they could have non-objective standards, but they can only enforce the objective standards, which is a huge deal. So that's another small seeming thing, and when you're pitching it, why would someone say no? But it's a really big deal to getting stuff approved. So a lot of times people will say that the city has to respect neighborhood context. What the hell is that? So now it's like your roof can't be more than 15 degrees tilted. You have to have a bay window. A bay window is, this wide and, this shape. So that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, another one that we're seeing with SB 9, which was our duplex and lot split bill, was a lot of jurisdictions are saying, oh, it has to be done in a Spanish colonial style. You could probably get an architecture PhD student to write a dissertation on what that means, and then everybody in the room would disagree with them. So,
Can you clarify? I think they only can't enforce they can't enforce discretionary standards only if they haven't met their RENA allocation, though, isn't it? Or is it on certain types of?
It's all the time. Although, so cities can put conditions that don't interfere with the density of the project. So a city can say, like, all right, we approve your 5,000 square foot triplex, but it has to be purple. It has to, if they can like enumerate all these objective things, they can force you to do them, but they can't just say, like, it doesn't respect neighborhood character, try again. And because when they can say it doesn't respect neighborhood character, try again, then you're kind of in an endless loop. But yeah, go ahead.
Just a suggestion. Could you just say the syntax of the EU needs to closely coincide with the syntax regarding fixed materials?
Closely coincide? What? Closely?
Emulate. What I'm saying is, instead of trying to write the purple shutter, just say you got to match these.
It's not, I mean, this is the funniest part of this is that, yeah, like it turns out a lot of people are a little fuzzy on like what does objective mean, and where does,
Because the initial problem is that whatever objective criteria you write doesn't mean not be contextual.
That, exactly right.
But it's always contextual with the existing house.
No, this creates an opportunity for non-contextual buildings. I'm sorry, everyone. This is the wrong crowd.
we'll have a designated objective design standards table at the dinner, and we can hash it out.
Yeah.
Michelle, first of all, I'm just thrilled to be here talking about these issues in Charleston, and of course with folks working on it here. I feel like so much of the housing discourse is about places like the Bay Area or places like New York City, places where we've known we've had a crisis for decades. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the Charleston perspective, and I think the Southeast perspective more broadly. How do you get I believe you lived in DC, right? I mean, how is the discourse happening differently in South Carolina, and what can other places learn from some of the conversations here?
For 5 years, we held an annual housing summit which is how we met Joe. Joe was one of our keynote speakers at one of our housing summits and did the work. And so we talk a lot here, but without that translating. So what I tell people is South Carolina has a population of about 5 million people. So as a state, we're like a large city. Charleston is usually top 100 for one of the most unaffordable places to live in the country. We are often at the top of the list or near the top in home ownership rate in the country, but that's because we have the largest percentage of mobile home ownership of any state in the country. We have the highest eviction rate in the country, 2.5 times the next closest state, which is Maryland. City of North Charleston was on the Eviction Labs list as the #1 eviction hotspot in the country. Columbia was number 8. And so understanding sort of what's happened in terms of housing in our state. Density is a 4-letter word here. And so if you begin to talk about density at all, you're going to have hundreds of people show up. No clue what that actually looks like. All they do is they hear the word density and they say we are opposed to it. And so I think what we have here is sort of a confluence of issues, and we don't necessarily talk to one another. And so we, care about the environment here. Sometimes it feels like we care about the environment more than we care about people. We care about the aesthetics. We care about our image, but we don't necessarily care about the people who don't fit into that image. And so what often happens is there's this sort of unseen, underlying, sort of detrimental impact to our housing policies that shows up in our schools. So I was sharing with someone earlier today that we are about almost to the 30-year mark for a school desegregation suit in Charleston County, which created Academic Magnet High School, which, if you know, Academic Magnet is often the #1 or #2 public high school in the entire country. It's here in Charleston County. It was created as a magnet within a predominantly black high school on the peninsula to desegregate the school district. Here we are 30 years later, that magnet has been separated from that school. It's the #1 or #2 school in the country, yet Charleston County has 15% of all of the poorest performing schools in the state. Those housing issues, those education issues are housing issues. They're reflective of decisions we've made around housing impact what's happening with our school system. Transportation issues in this community are housing issues. The fact that if there's an accident on I-26 in the morning, we're all going to be sitting there unable to go because we build for houses and not for the way we want to live. And so we don't talk about housing as infrastructure. We don't talk about investments in housing the same way we talk about investments in green space or water or transportation in this community. And it leaves a lot of people behind. And it's going to catch up to us if it hasn't already.
Oh, that's great. I think the connection to education is so central, and I don't think it's actually come up so far. Thank you. Ari, and then I'll open it up here real quick. First, we're still going for Euclid, right? We're still going to overturn Euclid v. Ambler, right?
Well, get right on that.
What a beautiful applause line. I love this audience. Normally I start talking about Euclid v. Ambler, the person has to go to the bathroom or refill their drink. Seriously though, I think part of the issue with reform in this space is I think your typical developer, not without reason, just takes a go along to get along approach. If they're getting jerked around by a city, either get used to getting jerked around or just walk away. Don't want to burn any bridges. Or especially with small business owners, it might not even occur to them to go talk to a lawyer about their opportunities. How do we overcome some of those challenges in reforming a lot of these rules where you have to find someone who's willing to fight those fights?
I think you're right. There is a certain self-selection problem. Part of it has to do with the fact that if you're trying to open a business or build a building or really do anything in any given place, you need to seek the permission of the powers that be, who are then going to be the people who will be regulating you thereafter should you be approved. Or should you not be approved, the same people who you're going to have to go in front of for the next thing that you want to do. Part of that, so part of the problem is the entire permission-seeking process. And most people do want to go along to get along. And when it comes to planning and zoning, a lot of people on planning and zoning boards aren't even elected. So you don't even have the power of threatening them at the ballot box if you want to wage some sort of political war against them. As far as people knowing about overcoming the challenges, I think as we continue to gather in spaces like this and talk about these issues and elevate them, people are going to become a little bit more aware of why their built environment looks the way that it does, why they can't afford to live within an hour and a half of where they work, and hopefully become more aware of organizations like mine that stand to defend the property rights of people who want to do unique and interesting things. We don't just represent builders. In fact, that's a very small fraction of what we do. A lot of them are small business owners who want to start the business that doesn't have one of the check boxes that you showed in your slide. And the same thing is true for builders. Government is reactive, it's not proactive, whereas entrepreneurs are always thinking about the next thing. And so when you walk into a zoning meeting with ION on a piece of paper, people freak out because they've never seen it before and they don't know what box to put it into. And if you don't fit into a box, then I can't approve you until you do. And that's kind of the pushback that a lot of you are going to be experiencing as you try to push forward with entrepreneurial things. Groups like IAJ are a resource to help you either navigate that process or, and I know I'm taking up too much time, but one thing that I want to touch on in my opening remarks, constitutional challenges in the context of zoning are hard, but they're not impossible. And one of the areas in which they're not impossible is where it becomes evident that the only reason why your thing is being denied is because of some weird sort of unspoken animus toward whatever it is that you're doing. Because government won't come out and say, we won't let you build this because we think poor people will come in. But if you are able to negate every other conceivable legitimate reason why they would prohibit you from building something, and the only thing that's left standing is some illegitimate basis, that is a viable constitutional challenge. That, I think, is kind of what's going on in a lot of these arguments is we don't want, insert group name here, socioeconomic bracket name here, we don't want them coming into our community and reducing property values. And you've got a complicit court system and government that believes that its job is to promote and uphold property values as though the point of having a government is to make housing more expensive, whereas it should be just agnostic and letting the market play out. So that's a long-winded answer to the question that you didn't ask, but yeah.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Michelle, I just want to say welcome to the bar, and I'm excited about your trajectory. Can you share with us some of the elements of our zoning code that you've seen in your experience that need to be changed?
So parking is a big one for me. I think here, so if you look at our demographic data, I think a quarter of all households in the Tri-County are a single person household. Yet, if you look at our parking requirements for most of our zoning ordinances here, they require that you have, at least one parking space per, household. But there's a lot of folks moving into Charleston who don't have a car. We have lots of college students who don't have a car. And so this sort of emphasis on having to have parking and parking spaces for every single housing unit, I think is both a waste of land, but also doesn't take into consideration our actual market. We also have another quarter of our households here are single parent with one child. And so I think we create these rules based on sort of these standards without really understanding who is our market. The minimum lot size issue, I think, is another huge issue in Charleston. You know, and you have to have a PUD to be able to do anything creative in this market. And so thinking about what might that look like if we change some of those requirements.
You almost said it, but I want to see if you meant it.
Yeah.
Are you saying the minimum parking requirements are in part in place in order to mandate that households must have at least enough extra money to pay for those cars to be eligible to live in those places? And isn't that a backdoor to violation of fair housing law?
I would think so.
And if you don't know what PUD stands for, please continue to live a happy life. Sir.
The Conservation League is just going to keep playing off each other. One of the, starting with Mount Pleasant, I think, is hitting all of these ills and evils and errors that we've been talking about. But one of the things that I've been seeing over the last couple of years from the advocacy side of the realm is North Charleston has been kind of quietly making some changes, and it goes back to the planners that actually want to do good, and they kind of distract their elected officials in order to slip the things through that we're not noticing, and getting rid of the setback requirements and the parking requirements that were put in place in the predominantly historically African American communities of the Neck area in the 90s, and erasing those in the last couple of years, and putting transit-oriented development overlays along some of our dead corridors, which is bringing some great revitalization. And I think that Reverend Bill is gone, but his group is doing a lot that are filling in these areas. And City of Charleston has been doing a lot of infill, and we saw some of it today. One of the things that I'm seeing a proliferation of, and I'm curious, any of you, all of you, how you think about it, is the phenomenon of the short-term rental unit. We're building stock, but it's not for, at least in this area, for the people to live in. It's for the tourists to come into. And we see some really great, creative, small, attainable, or what should be attainable housing, but it's not for the people who live here, so we're continuing to push people out. We're continuing to deal with the eviction rate issue, the lack of attainability of home ownership. We're seeing some major rental-only, suburban-style subdivisions that are rental-only, which is wild to me. But I'm just going to throw out the short-term housing rental unit. What do you all think about it? Does it play a role in what you think of? And do you see this as an issue in our country, region, community?
I'm just going to add a stat to that, because I met with the Charleston County Community Development folks last week, and the stat that they gave me is that 40% of all single-family homes in Charleston County are currently owned by major corporations. And so if you think about sort of the impact of this sort of short-term rental market in a place like Charleston that is tourist rich, very, we have visitors here 365 days out of the year. You know, I live in suburban, you know, North Charleston at the Somerville-North Charleston line, and I can tell you in my very sort of traditional neighborhood, there are a number of units that we know are just short-term units. You know, it's 40% today. What is that impact, I think, is a question we're going to have to answer as a community.
Feelings on this? Yeah, I would just add, you know, we talk a lot about, or I talk a lot about property rights. I think that's one of the biggest obstacles that you would have if you wanted to reduce the number of short-term rentals in a community. There are a number of people who buy properties with the intention of renting them out as short-term rentals. And if you were to make those illegal, you're going to run into a lot of potential takings, legal issues for those homeowners. But the other thing that I would add is that if you ask most landlords, I would think almost any landlord, whether they would rather have a long-term tenant in place or someone cycling through 2 days at a time, 5 days at a time. They're not all transient. Some people stay in short-term rentals for a couple months at a time, gig workers, things like that. But I think most landlords would tell you that all other things being equal, they would rather have a long-term tenant in place. There's continuity, consistency. The place is always occupied, so there's a safety thing there. And it's generally a more secure and certain revenue stream. The reason why a lot of these short-term rentals pop up, though, is because they're more profitable, and obviously people are motivated by the profit incentive. So my argument in response to that is if you want there to be fewer short-term rentals, if there is more housing stock, I mean, you know, we're all sort of, this is sort of an echo chamber, but like if there is more housing stock and there are more short-term rentals, that brings down the cost of short-term rentals, and that opens the door for more people to go back to offering places for long-term leases as short-term renting becomes less profitable. So there's a way to do this so that the economic driver behind the short-term rental boom is a little bit diminished, and that restores, I think, a lot of the housing stock that people are concerned about. I'm not super persuaded that that is the real reason for the rise in housing costs. Certainly it's a part of it, but I think the answer to this question, along with many others, is more supply.
There is a very long history of failure in this endeavor. And I can't help thinking that actually some of the ideas here are, although you can implement, that they will eventually crash the way they always have. And the reason is that they're all Rube Goldberg inventions. You don't directly do it. The United States housed 30 million penniless immigrants because there was no government intervention in any way without codes. Many of the older houses in the black neighborhoods that I know in New Orleans were built by granddaddy, you know, without loans. They were just allowed to do it. And they were transferred and granddaddy did it. And there's a long story to that, but we housed 30 million immigrants. Now, if we can also go back and not only rescind the zoning, but rescind all codes, people will actually build in a relatively self-interested way. They don't want to build something, go through the effort that's going to catch fire and destroy the sweat equity. That's not likely to happen unless we run pilot projects and see what actually happens, okay? But let's talk about Europe, which we don't think about enough. Europe is full of first-rate affordable housing ever since probably the 1890s. First rate, so good that you don't even notice it. It just fits everywhere. Do you know how that was funded? By the retirement funds of the unions. The retirement funds of the unions. Now we have unions, teachers unions and postmen unions and government unions that invest billions, like whatever the one in California is. CalPERS invests $6 billion a year, every single year, okay, for a government employees union, I believe it is. And they invested in, well, let's buy a little this and a little that. Why don't we force them to invest in housing? It's for your people. It's for your, it's literally for your people. Teachers unions, invest in housing at the level of teachers. And keep the income, keep an investment. We're looking at an incredible success story. We're always saying, what about Austria? What about Sweden? What about France? We all visit these wonderful projects that have lasted 30, 40, 50 years. It's union funding. The easiest, most straightforward way is to pass a law that says every single union has to build housing, X number, 10% of whatever they invest every year has to be housing commensurate with the needs of their employees, period, per state, and then we go home.
Please. So I want to challenge one thing. The unions are not, whatever, I don't know the math behind what you're doing, but I'm reasonably confident that the unions weren't funding money-losing housing, right, that's sold at below the cost of construction, right? So they might be investing in it, but there's money coming in from outside to make it affordable. And the second part is, in the last 10 years, we've had exactly what you're asking for, which is huge institutional investment in housing, a lot of it in the single-family stock, which Michelle mentioned. Build to rent is awesome, and we should not stop it. And like, whether that's good or bad, right, it's money in the system that's sort of chasing return, chasing a safe asset. But there's been a lot of people who are really unhappy with it. So if we say, okay, we should get more of this, I don't know if we should have more or less, but there's a lot of people saying we should have less.
The returns that are expected from the private sector are enormously higher than the returns. And for example, I forgot to say one more thing. You know, there was a savings bank, all over Europe, there are these savings banks for people, for regular folks, not for rich folks. And that was 100% of their investment was to build housing. And the return now, they only expect, what do banks give, 3% return? Do you see what I'm saying? Like, why should it be the private sector and Rube Goldberg inventions that builds the housing for the people who need it? It's your people, it's your school teachers that need the housing. Use their funds to build the housing. And by the way, keep it, it's an asset that is of value.
Yeah, as you mentioned, CalPERS is a big investor. They try to do housing projects. They run into the same shitty situations that private developers do. One of the projects that really inspired me in San Francisco.
Did they do it for affordable housing or high-end?
They're trying to make money. Their business is.
But you see, they're behaving like private sector.
Okay, but let me just tell you. Okay, so we had this public employee union, CalPERS, and also the waterfront, is another public agency that manages the waterfront, builds a seawall, maintains a seawall in San Francisco. So public agencies tried to build a luxury condo. Good, right? The revenues from that go back to the public in these two different ways, and progressives in San Francisco still killed it. So they try to invest in housing, but it's still hard to get it done. The thing about Europe, there wasn't money losing in Europe in what he's talking about in Vienna. The government built housing, and it was a public good, like Social Security, which is also something that doesn't necessarily lose money. Middle-income people, high-income people, anyone could live there, and you paid rent depending on your income. And so they didn't lose money. They cross-subsidized. In California, we do have a social housing bill proposed by Alex Lee. We are trying to make a state agency that would build this kind of social housing, and it's revenue neutral is the proposal. Last time in America, when we tried public housing, the reason that it ran to the ground was that it was designed to be money losing, which meant that it had to keep going back to the government to ask for money. And so small government folks, people who didn't like the beneficiaries, people who feel like poor people should actually be struggling all the time because otherwise they won't work, those people killed public housing by refusing to fund it. If we care about public housing and we want it, and we do, I think it's a neat idea, then we have to make sure that it's self-sustaining, which means that it's going to be mixed income. Middle and high-income people are going to live there too. So just like Social Security, Medicare, calls to means test housing are calls to destroy the program. You have to have mixed income.
Parking. Let's not have the parking requirement. That parking is required to get a mortgage. Quite independent of the code. There's no comparable that doesn't have parking. Therefore, what forces you is the mortgage, which means you're in the private sector problem. But I'm not talking about the public sector either. I'm talking about, actually in Europe, I just remember, it's the postal savings banks. Every country has a postal savings banks. Caisse d'Épargne, you see them, Postpark Kassenamt. What is that? That's the bank that workers put their money in, and it gets invested in housing. And they've existed for 100 years, and they hold the housing as an asset. So, why don't we, that is truly radical, because these people are investing, and they're investing, we say, well, don't invest in petroleum anymore. Okay, well, that's a good test. Now, invest in housing for your workers, specifically.
I'll just say one quick thing. I mean, I think the way I always frame zoning reform and land use reform is it's a necessary but not sufficient condition for getting to the place where we want to be. Of course, you have to have conversations, and you have to think about how housing's financed. You have to think about how it's designed, how it's built, where it's built. But in many cases, we have existing land use framework that even if the financing was there, even if unions were lining up to do this type of work, they couldn't build a project. But I hear you that this is, exactly, thank you.
So my question is that Honda makes Honda CRVs, Honda Accords, and Honda Civics, all different price points, but they're all made by Honda. Why is it in the housing industry we need unions to build housing for poor people and rich people to build housing for rich people and this group to build housing? Why is it that we have created a system where one developer is not able or capable or interested in building at every single price point? And is it not a reflection of the system that we've created that you can't build both the $1 million house and the $150,000 house?
I'm going to run until 5, if that's okay. 5 more minutes. Karen? Oh, please, yeah.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Ann. I want to just thank you all for the work you're doing. It's incredible work, and it's really exciting what's happening. I do want to take the conversation a little different direction because I'm just really thoughtful about this. So many of you know, some of you might not, that I actually wrote a book on zoning reform in 2008 called Form-Based Codes, based on the work that this community does in zoning reform. And that's the missing middle housing concept came out of our fight for zoning reform. And there's this tension between loosening up the rules to allow people to do what they want to do, which is what we've heard Vince talk about here in ION, right? That he couldn't do this again because the rules aren't possible. And there's been a lot of new urbanists that have worked on kind of parallel codes, right? The idea, and we talked about this, Nolan, the idea of, well, we'll at least pass a separate code so the developer can pick which one to build under, right? So it allows this idea of allowing good things to happen and allowing housing to happen. And oh my gosh, I can't thank you all enough for all of the bills in California. It's just changing work on the ground in really amazing ways. But there's this other tension, which is, Vince, you also mentioned this, which is the other developers that are building sprawl, which we can't have if we're going to address climate resiliency and climate change, will have the right answer in their back pocket. But they're not going to bring it out and build it unless they have to, because the system is set up to efficiently deliver detached single-family homes. And I know because I'm talking to a couple of California people, but also we see this everywhere. There's this tension between what's happening in the cities and needing to get more housing built to address the affordable housing program, and what's happening on the edges, which is continued single-family sprawl. And so if we don't have zoning, if we really wipe out zoning, how do we prevent that easy answer from happening? And so I'm thoughtful around this, this dichotomy of what's happening here, right? And are there rules that we put in place that are necessary for land preservation, that are necessary for efficient use of building enough housing? Are there, in Berkeley we've passed parking maximums. You are not allowed to use land near transit for parking any longer. You're not allowed to. That land has to be used for housing, right? Are there also density minimums? You have to build at least this much housing on this land. I don't personally zone using density, we zone using form, but the idea of I'm just curious your thoughts on this idea of zoning and abolishing zoning, and what do we do to make sure that our land is used in a way, because it is a community good, even though it's privately owned, it is still a community good, and we have to be careful with it.
So yeah, I actually think there's a big tension there. I don't think that you can get broad-based affordability in a high demand region without greenfield growth. Whether that's sprawl or not is in the eye of the beholder. I come from Massachusetts, where the area 25 miles from downtown is about 1 unit per acre. But supposedly Boston's not a sprawling city, and Houston is a sprawling city. Their 25 miles from downtown densities are 8 to 10 units per acre with quite a bit of multifamily mixed in. Now, Houston is, especially at 25 miles from downtown, it's a 100% car-dependent city, right? So total car dependence, there's lots of roads, but the densities are quite a bit higher than in the traditional Northeast. So I don't know how to judge which of those is better or worse in some regards. I think that we can build much better places, but we have to build replicating cities. If we build really good ones, then great. But with apologies to Andres, European cities, if you're not in subsidized housing, are extremely unaffordable. Right? My family moved from a very nice suburb of Boston to a nice suburb of Delft for a year, and we paid significantly more for a house 1/2 the size. And that's the reality all over Europe, is that they've made the choice to protect natural environments at the cost of really, really cutting into people's budgets on the housing side. And I think that's the choice a lot of California cities implicitly made. And we're trying to loosen up at least the interior, which is great. But I don't think there's a path to the kind of like adding 60% to the Bay Area's housing stock without some greenfield growth.
Yeah, this is the role for non-zoning land use controls, of which there are many. Which is why when I was like, these cities have no zoning, they don't have zoning, but you actually can't do whatever you want, right? There's still, in these places, you're gonna have to, depending on what you build, most things that you would propose, you would have to do an environmental impact report, which is a whole other world of regulation. But to me, you could have a low density place, but if you have the right street grid, if you have a grid, I like a grid, but if you have the right street layout, then it's not so hard to retrofit that suburbia later. So this is the role for, yeah. But yeah, I don't know if there's anybody here that can talk about like the way Freddie Mae and Fannie Mae. I know I was gonna mess it up. Yeah, these market makers mess up our ability to build small development. We would love to have some reform there.
With fourplexes, you have to, you can only get a commercial loan. I mean, you can get a private loan with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac for a fourplex, but you have to have enough income to prove that you can rent all 4 units all by yourself. You can't actually get a commercial loan. You can't use the rental income to back up your reason for getting a mortgage to buy a fourplex and then rent out the units. So there's an example of reform we need right there.
Also on the topic of why is it hard to develop small affordable houses, of course we all know that zoning intrinsically incentivizes building of big houses because unit allotments, the right to build a dwelling unit, tends to be a fixed cost when you buy a piece of land, so you're incentivized to build the biggest house you can with each allotment. Likewise, permitting costs tend to be fixed per dwelling unit. The cost of structural and civil engineering, the cost of stormwater tap fees, the cost of building permits, so you want to distribute that cost into as big a house as you can so that it doesn't eat up too much of your profits. Building codes, of course, also incentivize big houses because building codes require wide staircases, big doors, big windows, and all of that stuff just wastes a lot of usable space when you try to design a small house. That's all the government side, but I have found that probably the single biggest problem with developing small houses is real estate appraisals. Real estate appraisals tend to give you no benefit for having built a small house. They basically just value houses proportional to square footage. So a house that's twice as big is worth twice as much, which is not at all realistic to what it costs to build a house. A small house costs more per square foot to build than a big house of equal quality. Furthermore, a small house has to actually be better quality to be equally livable to a big house. I design a lot of very small houses, and I've always lived in very small houses, so I know that you simply have to have things like wainscoting and bookshelf walls and just better quality built-ins, better quality design for a really small house to be a space worth living in. So it's a high cost per square foot to build a house like that, and real estate appraisers just don't give you the credit for that. So, and it makes it really, really hard for it to be a profitable development scheme if your development scheme is building little houses and then financing them with a bank loan according to their appraised value. I've designed a lot of very small houses downtown, and almost all of them were built by developers who are building with their own cash, private loans or family money, and they're holding them as rental properties in the long, long term, meaning that these are developers who basically don't care what they appraise for. And that's the only kind of developer who's able to build really small urban houses. I wonder if any of you have thought about whether there's a way to intervene in the standards of appraisal so that the appraisal rules at the federal level could actually be rewritten on a sort of sliding scale with some understanding that, yes, actually really small houses are worth more per square foot than big houses.
Once we abolish zoning, we're coming for the appraisers. No, it's a fair question. I mean, this actually came up recently. I think part of the problem is the process of becoming trained and licensed as an appraiser. In many cases, it's very opaque. You can't actually get a certification. You have to work under someone. So there are a number of kind of issues where the field ends up being somewhat conservative and not very representative. So certainly something we're thinking about.
You know, the world of appraisers is 98% white men, and that's not me making up a hyperbolic statistic. It's a real true thing. The only interesting thing that I've ever heard a Georgist talk about is the idea, it was actually a Georgist who himself became an appraiser. So maybe, we can be the change we wish to see in the world.
So HUD does have a working committee right now. So Marcia Fudge, who's the HUD director, one of the first things she did, so there was a book that came out, I guess, or a paper that someone at Brookings did, I guess, about a year or two ago that talked about this sort of disproportionate impact of appraisals based on race. And so as a result of that, they have formed this study committee to look at the appraisal industry and to make recommendations. And so that is actively going on now. I would be happy to introduce you to some folks and so that your comments and yours can be considered as part of that process. But there is a study committee that's actively working right now and making recommendations at the federal level on what can be done with the appraisal industry.
This country that's affordable are mobile homes. 28% without subsidy, without a penny of subsidy. Mobile homes cost a maximum for the most luxurious type, $90 a square foot, 90. And it's quite independent of the local labor. And they're not permitted by people who don't want them. In places like Florida, you can't turn them down already. What keeps them away from people who really require them is the prejudice of everyone. Okay, including not only the rich white folk, but the poor colored folk. The people, nobody wants mobile homes, okay? Partially, it's because the old 1974 mobile homes really were hurricane bait. But if you see a mobile home actually torn up by a hurricane, right next to it is also a house torn up by a hurricane. Everything gets torn up by a hurricane, okay? Brick houses, concrete houses, that's gone. They changed the code in 74. The problem is that the designs are terrible. They're actually stronger than site-built houses. If you think about something that's 80 feet long, cantilevered, 30 feet in either direction, in a dynamic motion on the highway at 50 miles an hour, your brick house can't do that, okay? They're beautifully built. They can be up to 10-foot ceilings. It's just that the architects are too snobbish, Everybody's too snobbish, okay? And it's an industry that barely can get a permit for a new mobile home park. That is, from beginning to end, the answer. Okay, right now, if you're gonna do it now, it's that. If you want this to happen, don't let anybody turn down a mobile home park. Okay, just don't, you'll get the affordable housing in afterburners. Okay, and if you don't do that, you have not solved the problem, because that is the solution to the problem.
Yep, I think everybody on this panel totally agrees. I mean, we're already seeing a lot of that happen with ADUs, where a lot of them are manufactured, and they're just being dropped into, and that's how you're gonna build housing at scale, extremely cheaply. So thank you. Everyone on this panel is doing incredible work. We're in a really amazing moment right now. We're making progress on this. Get in touch if you have ideas, support these organizations, and thanks to everyone for joining us for this.